Hi, everyone. Freddie Kiger, and welcome all of you to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's General Alumni Association series, North Carolina History. And today we are going to venture into a realm of something that most North Carolinians are quite familiar with, the Moravians of North Carolina, who have an incredible history. And so we dive in for that. Thank you all for joining us. On the 6th of January, 1766, in then Rowan County's Moravian settlement of Bethabara, the watchword was most appropriate for what was going on 6 miles to the south. The passage for the watchword was from the Old Testament book Isaiah, 37th chapter, 35th verse. It read, "I will defend this city." On this freezing Monday in January, there was no city, but a seed was being planted. Indeed, it was so cold that the night before, drugs dissolved in home distilled spirits froze and burst bottles on the shelves of the apothecary shop. No matter. Timber needed for building structures had to be cut in January and February when the sap was down. But the temperature was frightful. These hardy pioneers were accustomed to all kinds of weather, so it did not cross their minds to put off the task at hand, the beginning of a new town. It would be raised on a tract of land bought back in 1753. It had long been the plan to plant a town in the center of the near 100,000-acre tract, a tract where inhabitants might be free to live according to their ideal of a Christian community. The site that had been selected back on a Thursday, February the 14th, 1765, 12 years after these missionaries had discovered an abandoned cabin which they renovated to seek immediate shelter from the wintry blast of 1753. That first site was the very first village in Wachovia, and as we mentioned, they called it Bethabara. The watchword that Thursday, February the 14th, was also appropriate for their, if you will, setting up shop. The verse was from the 8th chapter and 15th verse of 1 Kings. "Let thine eye be open toward this house night and day, even toward the place of which thou hast said, my name shall be there." Here at Bethabara, in this photo taken somewhere between 1890 and 1910, still stands the oldest Moravian church in North Carolina. 6 years later, on a Tuesday in June 1759, in the very midst of the French and Indian War, the Moravian Brethren of Wachovia founded a second settlement 3 miles to the northwest, Bethania. Like Bethabara, it too took root, but now, on the cold morning of the 6th of January, 1766, the time had come to carry out the plan for the central town. True, there may have been a few that thought the effort unnecessary. Why not continue where so good a start had already been made? But others made clear that the original plan had the approval of the Lord. So while letters were sent to their headquarters to bless this endeavor, which had been planned, well, it was going to proceed. The religious home was half a world away in Herrnhut, an upper Lusatian town in the Görlitz district of Saxony. Here's where Herrnhut would be located on a modern map of Germany. It was there in 1722 that Nicholas Ludwig, Count von Zinzendorf, lent his powerful influence in establishing what we know as the Moravian Church. And as evidence of the Moravian drive to spread their good word, 44 years later, on this bright, frigid morning, the band of sturdy men some looking forward to homes of their own in the new central town, others lending a communal hand in the undertaking, tramped 6 miles southward from the Fabra. At their head was Johannes Etwein, who was a representative in Wachovia of the Unity Boards. To 7 men from Bethabra and 5 from Bethania, the task of building the first structure in the new town had been entrusted. They took with them tools and a tent to be used as shelter for the night. They also carried axes and hatchets and spent the day clearing the road, which had been only partly opened the preceding spring. First, though, after arrival at the site, there beside the west branch, hymns were sung and the first tree felled. Willing hands cleared a sufficient piece of ground. The cutting and hewing of logs began, and by Wednesday, enough were ready to raise the first structure. They continued their labor. On Thursday, January the 30th, there arrived letters from Herrenhut, which brought the name for this new town. It would be called Salem. It meant peace. Another Moravian red letter day was the 19th of February, a Wednesday, when 8 single brethren left Bethabra and moved to Salem. Those 8, we know. Pennsylvania farmers George Holder and Michael Ziegler, Dutch brewer and cook Niels Peterson, Dane anchor maker Jens Schmidt, German weaver Gottfried Kretzel, English cloth maker John Burkhead, Pennsylvania miller Jacob Steiner, and Austrian stonemason and bricklayer Melchior Rasp. They became the first permanent residents of Salem, and what would be 147 years later, Winston-Salem. To house them, Salem's first structure, the builder's home. From here, single brethren rose each day and built a town. Their progress documented. On Saturday, the 12th of April, 1766, sites for the first square, the graveyard, God's Acre, and first private home were selected. 4 months later, the industrious people who carved the Fabra, Bethania, and Salem out of the Wachovia wilderness held an event that has become a signature of the Moravian Church. On the 18th of August, a Monday, the Moravians of Salem, North Carolina, staged their first love feast. The watchword that day was from the 24th chapter of Numbers, 21st verse. Strong is thy dwelling place, and thou puttest thy nest in a rock. And so Salem began in 1766, and to put that in historical perspective, it was 3 years after the French and Indian, or the 7 Years' War, had ended, and ended with resounding British victory. That worldwide conflict, however, created Native American unrest up and down the frontier of England's North American colonies, and fear of attack drove citizens of Bethabra to erect a stockade. In 1766, the 13 American colonies were under the reign of George III, King of Great Britain and King of Ireland. His colonies in America numbered almost 2 million souls, and here in this royal colony of North Carolina, population hovered around 200,000. It was a year when the 13 colonies found reason to unite and organize for Parliament to recoup the massive expenses spent in waging war, sought to fill governmental coffers by means of a Stamp Act. Much to their surprise, there was spirited colonial resistance up and down the Atlantic coast. So much so that on March the 18th of that same year, 1766, Parliament repealed the offensive tax, but not before ships of the Cape Fear had been seized for transporting illegal documents that did not bear the required stamp. On April the 3rd, the colonies learned of Parliament's decision, but as we all know, colonial rejoicing was short-lived. There would be more taxes, acts, legislation, reaction, confrontation. These were all elements to the Moravian Church. Its creation, born out of similar push and pushback. That leads us to a brief history of the founding of the faith. The movement that would evolve into the Moravian Church began in the early 15th century with a Catholic priest named Jan Hus, who was motivated to do so by a reaction to practices of the Roman Catholic Church. Hus wanted to return the church in Bohemia and Moravia to the practices of early Christianity. Now, let me quickly pause to point out where Bohemia and Moravia were located. Bohemia, which would today be in the Czech Republic, was bordered to the south by Upper and Lower Austria, which today, of course, is Austria, bordered to the west by Bavaria, and to the north by Saxony and Lusatia, all three in Germany today. To the northeast, today, Poland, Silesia, and on the east by Moravia, which, like Bohemia, is today in the Czech Republic. The reforms Hus suggested included performing the liturgy in the language of the people, allowing lay people to receive both the bread and the cup during communion, eliminating papal indulgences and the whole idea of purgatory. This movement gained royal support and a certain independence for a while, even spreading across the border into Poland. But with push and with action, there came reaction, and all was eventually forced back to the subject and governance in Rome. Yet, a contingency of Hus's followers, called Utraquists, struck a deal with Rome that allowed them to embrace most of their doctrinal goals as long as they recognized the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. Though it displeased Rome, remaining Hussites continued to operate outside Roman Catholicism, and within 50 years of Hus's death, became independently organized as the Bohemian Brethren, or Unity of the Brethren. I mentioned the death of Jan Hus. Yes, Rome had its way with him. Condemned as a heretic by the Catholic Church, he was burned at the stake on the 6th of July, 1415. Before the execution, he knelt down, spread out his hands, and prayed aloud. While doing so, the executioner undressed him, tied his hands around his back, and bound his neck with a chain to a stake around which wood and straw had been piled, covering him to the neck. At the last moment, officials asked Hus to recant the opportunity to perhaps save his life, but he refused. At the age of, we believe, 45 or 46, his life was taken. He became a key predecessor to the Protestant movement of the 16th century. 42 years later, what he started became the Bohemian Brethren's Church. Now, let me emphasize Hus's role as it related to the Protestant Reformation. Keep in mind, he was executed for challenging the power and teachings of the Roman Catholic Church in 1415. The man usually credited for the Reformation, Martin Luther, was ordained to the priesthood in 1507 and posted his 95 Theses in 1517, over 100 years after Hus's execution. Therefore, the Moravians were the earliest Protestant church to rebel against the authority of Rome. A few words about the first signs of Protestantism at that time in that corner of the world. The anti-Catholic movement was significant by the middle of the 16th century. As many as 90% of the inhabitants of Czech lands were Protestant. That number included far more than commoners. Even the majority of the nobility was Protestant, and it was they who allowed what was at that time most unusual and even shocking universal education. They encouraged the flourishing of schools, which had been started by Moravians, and the establishment of printing shops. In fact, local nobles not only supported Brethren doctrine, but joined their ranks in asserting their independence from the Catholic-dominated Habsburg Empire in Vienna. The movement became so widespread that by the middle of the 16th century, there was not a single Czech town that did not have a Protestant school, and many had more than one. And in each of those schools, 2 to 6 teachers. Take, for example, Jihlava, which was a principal Protestant center in Moravia. Within, there were 6 schools, 2 Czech, 2 German, 1 for girls, and 1 that taught in Latin. That school's curriculum was high grammar school level and included lectures on Latin, Greek, Hebrew, rhetoric, dialectics, fundamentals of philosophy, and fine arts, as well as religion. And with the University of Prague, whose seal you see here, firmly entrenched under Protestant guidance, the local Catholic Church under Rome's influence simply could not compete in the field of education. Therefore, to counter, Jesuits were sent in with the blessing and backing of the Catholic Habsburg rulers. And even as they did, Bohemia and Moravia's nobility were able to force Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II to issue a 1609 letter of majesty, which safeguarded religious freedom. Yet backlash was coming. Rudolph II was succeeded in 1612 by his brother Matthias, who, in an effort to squash Protestant doctrine, worked behind the scenes to have the fiercely Catholic Ferdinand of Styria ascend to the Bohemian Moravian throne. In 1618, aware of this subterfuge, and with 2 Protestant churches forced to close, Bohemia and Moravia noblemen reacted. Fearful of losing their religious freedom, they began what we call the Bohemian Revolt, one that was put down in 1620, the same year the Pilgrims landed at Massachusetts Bay. At the Battle of White Mountain, fought on the 8th of November, 1620, an army of 15,000 Bohemians and mercenaries were defeated by some 27,000 men in the combined armies of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. The site of the battle is now part of the city of Prague. Defeat decisively dictated the fate of Czech lands for the next 300 years, and drastically changed its religious landscape after 2 centuries of Protestant dominance. Roman Catholicism, back in control, held a majority of Czech lands until the late 20th century. Also, as a consequence of defeat, local Protestant noblemen were either executed or expelled from the country, while Austrian Habsburgs put Catholic and mostly German-speaking nobility in their place. Defeat even had its consequences beyond politics and religion in popular culture. Czech language was gradually reduced to little more than a means of communication used by the peasants. To the people of this region, this era is referred to as the Dark Age of the Czech nation. Simply put, Protestants were given an ultimatum. They were forced to either leave the many and varied southeastern principalities of what was the Holy Roman Empire, mainly Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, and parts of Germany and its many states, or go underground to practice their faith secretly. This forced many Moravian brethren to eventually migrate west across northern Europe, as far west as the Low Countries, where Bishop John Amos Comenius attempted to direct a resurgence. So the brethren, recoiling from defeat and persecution, migrated to worship as they wished. With the shifting, their largest numbers and communities were found in Lisa, Poland, a nation which has historically strong ties with the Czechs. Isolated, Smaller groups, worshiping in secret, remained in Moravia. Enter Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf, a nobleman born in 1700 in Dresden, Saxony. He was brought up in the traditions of Pietism, a 17th century movement that strove for the revival of piety in the Lutheran Church. Zinzendorf was well-heeled, well-educated. He studied law at the university to accommodate the wishes of his family, but his main interest was in the pursuit of his religious ideas. So much so that in 1722, he left the court in Dresden to spend more time on his estate at Berthelsdorf, where he hoped to establish a model Christian community. It was out of his commitment to help the poor and needy that Zinzendorf agreed to a request that persecuted Protestants from Moravia might be allowed to settle on his lands. That request, interestingly enough, originated with an itinerant carpenter by the name of Christian David. Among those who accepted his offer were members of the Bohemian Brethren, who had been living as an underground remnant in Moravia for nearly a century. 1722, those refugees established a new village about 2 miles from Zinzendorf's Berthelsdorf, a place called Herrnhut. Again, today, Herrnhut is located in eastern Germany, very close to the borders of the Czech Republic and Poland. Here, a recent photograph, a town of maybe 300 back then. It grew steadily, but sadly, major religious disagreements arose, and by 1727, the community divided into bitter factions. Zinzendorf stepped in. He mixed feudal authority with charismatic personality and restored a semblance of unity. Then on, appropriately enough, a Sunday, the 13th of August, 1727, the community experienced an epiphany, following an experience which the citizens of Herrnhut attributed to the presence of the Holy Spirit, similar to that recorded in the Bible on the day of Pentecost. Every citizen experienced a powerful, dramatic transformation, which they, as they put it, learned to love one another. It is recorded that many of the divisive issues were settled by this spiritual-like revival. And while doctrinal views that were different still occasionally threatened the unity of the community, Count Zinzendorf, from then on, was able to maintain a spirit of harmony. And so, that spirit of revival led to Herrnhut's growth, so much so that the town became the breeding ground for a major movement for Christian rededication and for the sending of missionaries during the 18th century. Moravian historians identify their main achievements during that time period as establishing a prayer watch of continuous prayer, which ran uninterrupted 24 hours a day for 100 years. Another, on May the 3rd, 1728, the creation of the daily watchwords, still published today in 50 languages. It is the oldest and most widely read daily devotional work in the world. To further explain, Old Testament texts, the watchwords, are chosen by lot annually in Herrnhut from a collection of 1,200 verses. New Testament texts, referred to as doctrinal texts, are then selected to offer comment on the watchwords. Another achievement, the global establishment of over 30 settlements, all based on the Herrnhut model, each which emphasized a lifestyle of prayer and worship. Also, preeminent in form of communal living in which personal property was still held, but a simple lifestyle and generosity with wealth were vital spiritual attributes. Thus, divisions between social groups and extremes of wealth and poverty were largely eliminated. Another achievement, This one important for North Carolina's Moravians, the sending out of hundreds of Christian missionaries to parts of the world that included the Caribbean, North and South America, the Arctic, Africa, and the Far East. In fact, Moravian missionaries comprised the first large-scale Protestant missionary movement. They were the first to send unordained lay people rather than trained clergymen, the first to minister to slaves, and the first to carry their faith to every corner of the world. Zinzendorf aided that. Thanks to his personal contacts with their royalty, Moravian missions journeyed to the Dano-Norwegian Empire. While attending the coronation of Denmark's Christian VI, Zinzendorf himself was profoundly moved by two Inuit converts from a mission to Greenland, which had been established in 1733, and also an African from the West Indies. Again, because the Moravians have meticulously documented their history, we know that their very first mission was established in 1732 on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas. It was done by two men. One was a potter, Johann Leerhard Dober, and the other, a carpenter by the name of David Nietzschmann. We even know of their work. To this specific locale, the two, true, did arrive after Anglican missionaries, but it was reported that locals preferred the Moravian message. Mark A. Knoll, the author of The Rise of Evangelism, which was published in 2003, wrote that, quoting him, Anglican Christianity remained remained resolutely hierarchical, made much of status and hereditary roles, and maintained sharp racial divisions. By contrast, the Moravians seemed to offer a far more inclusive style of church life. Once again, quoting, the Moravians encouraged blacks to sing with whites, preached spiritual equality before God, and welcomed the expression of religious emotion. So radical were the Moravians for their time that one of the early workers in St. Thomas actually took a bride of mixed race, a step that brought down the wrath of the island's white planters. The Moravians also encouraged black preachers and welcomed them in leadership positions in both small groups and congregations. The two and other Moravian missionaries began to plant churches in Jamaica in 1754, Barbados the next year, and Antigua in 1756. They were permitted to operate with the blessing of planters that were under close scrutiny. The author Knoll adds, on Antigua, there was a special response with over 11,000 in Moravian churches by the end of the century. And finally, to reinforce practicing what they preached, there are claims, although nothing has been documented, and again stressing that some Moravian missionaries voluntarily sold themselves into slavery. Returning to the fifth significant accomplishment during this period of Moravian development, there was the forming of many hundreds of small renewal groups which operated within the existing churches of Europe, and they were known as diaspora societies. These groups encouraged personal prayer and worship, Bible study, confession of sins, and mutual accountability. We now turn our attention to missionary work that brought the Moravians to the 13 English colonies, and specifically North Carolina. First off, North Carolina was not the first, and it may surprise you, nor was Pennsylvania. Initially, to the 13 colonies, Moravian missionaries first attempted settlement in Savannah, Georgia. However, in 1740, due to complications that included Spanish threat and leadership withdrawal, a select number of the Moravian settlers moved north to Nazareth, Pennsylvania. 1 year later, it was Nietzschmann and Count Zinzendorf who founded yet another mission in Pennsylvania. That site, established on Christmas Eve, was aptly named Bethlehem, and is currently the 8th most populated city in the Keystone State. As to how Moravians made it to what would become the Old North State, well, we have to thank Bishop August Gottlieb Spangenberg, who in December of 1752 purchased 98,985 acres from John Carteret, the second Earl Granville, at about 35 cents an acre. Spangenberg and his band of Moravian surveyors had found, as he put it, a body of land which is probably the best left in North Carolina. He also wrote that the land on which we are now encamped seems to me to have been reserved by the Lord for the brethren. Of course, that tract of land was Der Valkow Creek along the meadow, or as we say today, Wachovia. The name taken from one of Zinzendorf's ancestral estates on the Danube River in Lower Austria. First Moravian settlement in North Carolina was, as we alluded to earlier, at Bethabara, along the banks of Muddy Creek, stream that I played beside many, many years, not far from Rural Hall as a kid. It was founded on a Saturday, November the 17th, 1753, when 12 to 15 German-speaking members of the Unitas Fratrum Moravians arrived after a September departure from Christianbrug in eastern Pennsylvania. They were a diverse group. The number included a doctor, minister, carpenters, farmers, tailors, shoemakers, and millers, all skills needed to carve a settlement out of the wilderness. On their arrival, after a 6-week journey down the Great Wagon Road, they found an abandoned cabin. Upon occupation of that structure, they had a simple meal, and to no surprise to us, the men then prepared a love feast, the traditional Moravian ceremony of sharing bread or cake and coffee, wine, or tea. Bethabara was so named for it meant house of passage. In other words, the settlement was meant to be temporary until the central town could be established. Though intended to be only temporary, it wasn't long before others on the frontier learned of the skilled tradesmen now living in the new settlement. Bethabara became a magnet for those in need on the North Carolina frontier. For example, Bethabara's Jacob Lusch, whose God's Acre marker is still easily found, wrote on the 14th of August, 1754, Brother Calberland's fame as a doctor is spreading. Patients are coming to him from as much as 80 miles away, and he has been called to others at points nearly as distant. Work is beginning to come to the craftsmen. Indeed, Bethabara became a center for religion, governance, trade, industry, culture, education, and the arts. There, Moravians constructed over 75 buildings during the first 20 years of the settlement's existence. And during the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, the settlement and its 2 forts served as defensive havens for nearby settlers. There was also a supply depot for the Catawba allies of the British. Today, the 1788 Gemeine House is the last surviving example of an 18th century German American church with attached living quarters remaining in the United States. Returning to that first evening in November after the 15 arrived, Reverend Bernhard Adam Grube noted, while we had held our love feast, the wolves howled loudly. But all was well with us, and our hearts were full of thanksgiving to the Savior who had so graciously guided us and led us. A Moravian diarist noted, Nathaniel and Jacob Lusch measured off 8 acres of land, which is to be cleared at once so that wheat can be sown. Others began to gather the dead wood and build bonfires. Now, despite the talent and commitment, no question, life on the frontier was tough and lonely. It would be almost 2 years before the next large group of settlers arrived. Moravian diarists wrote on their arrival in November of 1755. They arrived toward evening on November the 4th and were heartily welcomed. There were 7 married couples, 10 single brethren, and 5 drivers for the wagons. Single brethren were lodged in the old dwelling house, and the married people in the first story of our new brother's house. We are much crowded. Within 3 years, the small band grew to 65 people. What was once an abandoned cabin was now a thriving village. A diarist noted in January of 1756, we are especially busy with the building of the new Gemeinhaus and the mill for which certain brethren were detailed to make boards and shingles. Despite the growth, there were trying times. French and Indian War that we mentioned spread throughout the southern frontier in 1756. Travelers passing through Bethabara spoke of wandering bands of Cherokee who murdered nearby settlers. Another diarist wrote in July of 1756, it was decided to protect our houses with palisades, for if the settlers were all going to retreat, we would be the last left on the frontier and the first to be attacked. All who were not busy with the harvest went to work the same day. And by the 23rd, the palisade was finished, except the gates. Bishop Spangenberg noted the insecurities, and in a letter to Count Zinzendorf in June of 1760 wrote, our brethren keep a constant watch, which is necessary and also good for the country. For many neighbors have come in to them with all their movable possessions, as well as wives and children. Despite the conflict and reports, neither the Shawnee nor the Cherokee attacked the Moravian settlement during the French and Indian War. Rather, sickness claimed far more lives than Native Americans. A fever epidemic ran rampant through the crowded refugee huts near the mill and through Bethabara. 8 Moravians and several in the settlement near the mill died. After her new husband, Dr. Hans Martin Kaliberban, died of the epidemic, Sister Anna Katharina began caring for one of the newly orphaned children. Thus began her life of service to Bethabara until she died in 1816. Her 90 years of life symbolic to the importance Moravians placed on the full participation of women in community life and on the education of their children. As we've made mention, the second Moravian village was laid out in 1759. The second town in the Wachovia tract, named Bethania, which means house of the figs or house of the poor. The village was laid out in part to deal with the crowded conditions brought on by refugees. After 13 years in the wilderness, some 166 people lived in the 2 communities. Despite Bethabara and Bethania, the Moravians never lost sight of their master plan. They were driven to create a central main town. And though in and on the frontier, they saw the surrounding woods not as intimidating, but inviting. Surveyor Johann Christian Reuter was even appointed forester to oversee the cutting of trees. Today, we would call him an environmental planter. Beautifully, he drafted an inventory of plants and animals. For example, he noted and recorded the following. Dogwoods is so called because it stinks. It grows around the valleys, does not become large, but is hard and is good on the turning lathe. Of course, the future state flower of this state. Muskrats, he continues, are water animals like young fat poodle dogs, brown like a beaver, smell like musk. Skins are generally sold for young beaver. He also noted that the first week of May, a panther and a number of wolves were troublesome. Moravian industry and skill were on the same par as their devoutness. We mentioned earlier that Bethabara and Bethania were filled with craftsmen. A Moravian diarist noted in 1761 that people gathered from 50 and 60 miles away to buy pottery. But many came in vain, as the supply was exhausted by noon. We regretted not being able to supply their needs. They even reached out beyond their regional markets to the Atlantic market with Europe. From a Moravian diary dated March 3rd, 1763, our wagon and Mr. Hamilton's wagon left for Charlestown, of course today Charleston, taking 3,000 pounds of deer skins, some butter, and beaver skins. Though Bethabara reached its high point of development and population by 1766, its energy moved to take on the most ambitious undertaking, the founding building of Salem, which, as we've established, was to become the central congregational town, and which we noted in our opening tonight. Site selected February 14th, 1765. Plans for the new town determined from their European base in Herrnhut, August the 16th of that same year. First tree felled January 6th, 1766. And that's a good place to stop for part one. We'll pick up with the building of the central town of the Moravians in the winter of 1766 at what today would be Winston-Salem. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Douglas. Thank you, Dave Drake. And thank you again for being with us. And I hope that you will tune in for part two of the Moravians in North Carolina.